Hello, and welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, a weekly conversation with women who found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode number 31. If you're a first-time listener, welcome. And if you're a returning listener, thank you so much for coming back. If you're looking for more information about the podcast, past guests, want to catch up on previous episodes, or just want to drop me a line, it's all at the website, desertladydiaries.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries. On her earliest trips to the desert, today's guest Barbara Harris became fascinated with giant rock and the Integratron. This episode is packed with history of local legends as well as conversation about the spirituality surrounding the rock and what residents and visitors can do to keep this area preserved for everyone. Today, my guest is Barbara Harris. She's a local historian who was born in Pennsylvania, who I didn't think we discussed that at all beforehand. I'm from Jersey originally, who researched giant rock and the Integratron for many years. As a former president of the Morongo Basin Historical Society, she has combined her business skills with knowledge of the desert into a unique form of storytelling. Recently, Giant Rock has been revised as a tourist destination, and Barbara, through her unique form of storytelling, website, giantrockproject.com, and Facebook presence, has made a commitment to restore Giant Rock to its original grandeur. Barbara brings an awareness to the atrocities plaguing the area with illegal dumping, obscene graffiti over Giant Rock, and the surrounding boulders. She spent years working with a small group of concerned citizens from the Homestead Community Council to make Highway 247 Old Woman Springs Road a designated state scenic highway. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you for all your hard work.
Hi, Dawn. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Usually how I start the podcast is I ask, what was your first experience with the desert?
Well, I was very new to California. I came from Pennsylvania.
Where in Pennsylvania?
A little town outside of Pittsburgh.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, a little place called Portview, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
It's McKeesport. Yeah, just a little place outside Pittsburgh.
I did a little school in Pittsburgh. It was actually downtown. I lived across from the Civic Arena.
Yeah. So you're familiar with the area.
Yeah,
The area.
I am, yeah.
So anyway, after I graduated from the Art Institute, graduated in December, packed up my portfolio, had only $42 in my pocket, picked up, and in February, moved to California, came out here for the big dream. And while I was out here, I was looking for jobs, doing stuff, and growing, and met a guy who I was starting to date. I had a friend back east, and his father had passed away. It was really traumatic for me because we were very close. So my new boyfriend out here, he was a California boy through and through. Ever since he was young, 17 years old, was coming out here to the desert. And I knew nothing about a desert.
Sure.
Nothing. Being really distraught and really sad about my friend's death, he took 2 sleeping bags, threw it in the car, and says, "Come on, we're going to go for a ride." All I remember of that night is we were driving. We're driving from the coast, and all the city lights, all the freeways, and you're driving. And then I remember actually going up what I now know as the grades. Now I know them as the Morongo grade and the Yucca grade. Yeah. And I'm looking up at the stars, and I'm looking up at the hills, and I'm going, where are we going? I don't know this man that well. What are we doing? And it's getting darker, and it's getting darker. And here we go. We're going farther and farther out into nowhere land. And where he was taking me was to a little cabin off of Lear. And it's where his parents' friends had a cabin, and they would go dirt bike riding. And so my first experience was that night with sleeping bags under the stars, laying there watching the sky.
Amazing. And
from that, he introduced me to Giant Rock. He took me down there, showed me Giant Rock, and told me about a man named George Van Tassel, and showed me Integratron, told me about this man, and then he gave me background into Van Tassel and said, when I met him when I was 17 years old, we kind of thought that the guy was maybe in the desert a little bit too long. And he says, and then he would tell me about, they would hold these, what he called them, these Trekkie conventions out there, but this was, for him, this was in the mid-70s. So for him, this was when the actual spaceship conventions were starting to wean off. They were starting to go away. So he didn't know the full history.
Right. Well, a few episodes back, I interviewed an attorney in Yucca Valley. She's like 89 years old. It's Dee Davis. I don't know if you know her. Her first experience in the desert was as a journalist for the San Bernardino Sun to come out and cover the first interplanetary spacecraft convention at Giant Rock.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and it was a great episode. You'll have to go check it out.
I'd love to talk
Yeah, and
to
you
her.
probably should meet her. Yeah.
Yes, really would.
You probably should meet her. So you have this experience of coming out here. You hear about George von Tassel. And so how did you make the decision then? What happened in between that and actually moving here?
Well, this is where it gets interesting because I moved to California in 1978. Okay, my first trip to the desert was in 1979. I ended up marrying this man in 1981. However, during this whole time now, we keep coming to the desert. We're drawn to this desert. This is where we come. We come here to play. We've already now, 1981, we get married. We start a business together. The internet is starting to come into its own. We're growing a business. We're living in Yorba Linda. And I'll never forget the day, too. We would be coming out here and we would stand at the gates of the Integratron. And we would stand there. And at the time, there was a man named Emil Canning who owned the Integratron. And you couldn't get in to the gates for many, many, many years. And it was 20 years that we would be coming back and forth, just playing in the desert like most people do, and always wanting to get into the Integratron.
Sure.
And we started this business, and we had this magazine. Got to remember, waiting 20 years to get onto the Integratron. And one day, out of the blue, I get a phone call from a lady in Arizona who calls me up. She was an author writing for our magazine. And she calls me up and says, "Hey, Barbara," she goes, "do you ever hear of this thing out in Joshua Tree called the Integratron?" And here you go, 20 years.
Wow. I'm
going, yeah, I kind of have. And she goes, I just met the new owners. This is the year 2000. 1981, we were married. 1979 was my first experience of even seeing the Integratron.
Wow.
I waited from 1979 to the year 2000. And somebody finally called me and said, "Barb, there's new owners of the Integratron. Would you like their number? Would you like to meet them? Here, I just came from a retreat there."
Oh my gosh.
So I said, "Yeah, sure. Of course. Oh,
yeah."
So that was in February of 2000. I called Joanna. I says, "Hi, I'm Barbara. Can I come out and meet you?"
Yes.
She says, "Yeah, sure." I was out the next weekend, came out to the desert, met Joanna, met Nancy, who became friends. Next thing I knew, my husband and I were spending 4 days a week here in the desert, leaving our business to the employees on the office in Anaheim. And we were coming out here, spending 4 days a week here in the desert, working at the Integratron with Joanna and Nancy, just going back and forth for 2 years. Until finally, after spending enough time at Super 8, sleeping on the floors, sleeping in the desert, doing whatever, we looked at each other and said, maybe we should buy a house here.
That is a great story.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So you just have now, having been there and been introduced to it, you've just loved this place from the start.
Yeah.
Really?
Many times I compare my story, and even as I've gotten more involved with Giant Rock and the desert and the desert community, I tell people, if they've ever seen the story of Close Encounters and they've seen Richard Dreyfuss when he's building the Devil's Tower, in one of the scenes he's building the Devil's Tower out of mashed potatoes, and he's really obsessed and he has to build the Devil's Tower. He has to build it. I'm going, Yeah, that's kind of like me and Giant Rock. I go, it's so obsessive sometimes. I
Right.
can't put it away.
Well, I'll tell you, I've been out there once. It's the only time I've been out there. I've been to the Integratron a couple of times. But the first time I went to Giant Rock, you get there and it's like, wow, oh my gosh, this rock is huge. And then you walk around it and then you come out the other side and there's this concrete pad.
Yes.
As soon as I stepped on that concrete pad, my body just lit up. There was just some energy that I definitely felt there. So it's a pretty amazing place. Since you've been coming out here that long, you've seen the rock when it was whole, and you've seen the rock with the broken piece.
Yes.
Did you come out right away when you learned that it had fallen? What was your experience with that?
That was quite interesting when that happened because I had no knowledge of it breaking. When it had broken that February, we were on our usual trip out to the desert just to play. And we were just driving down 247. And I remember just driving down the road and just feeling a different energy that day, driving down the road. And not having a clue that 2 days before that it had split, we were coming just out to the rock.
Right.
And when we pulled out, drove down the dirt road and pulled up to the rock, it was the most profound feeling and the most unusual feeling I ever had. At first, I looked up and there were 5 people, and there was a man and he had his 2 kids, and then it was Rob and I, and then there was another couple pulling up, and we just all kind of stood there, and everybody was just standing there stunned. And it was still bright white because it had still, nobody had got graffitied it yet.
Right.
And we were all just standing and everybody was quiet. It was like something happened. And my first feeling was I wanted to break down and cry. I felt, oh my gosh, what happened? What happened? I felt so sad. Then my next instinct was I wanted to go and lean against the rock that had split. And when I went to go lean across it, I'm somewhat of a sensitive. These are kind of stories that I get. These are feelings that I get to feel. So when I leaned into the rock and I laid back into the rock, I had a feeling, I had this story that this rock was like sharing with me. And she said it was time. And as I inquired more about it, she was showing me this story about how for eons of time and all throughout time, this rock is millions and millions of years old. It had held on to stories and knowledge and secrets of humankind. And it was time to let that now be known to mankind.
Wow.
So there's all these stories about how it happened, why it happened, who did it, this,
Right. Yeah.
I don't get
Everybody has a theory.
Yeah. I haven't really let myself get hung up into that because I always tell people that the most important thing is it picked that day, that February 21st of 2000 to split off. Out of all the time in history, millions of years, that date, that's the day that it opened up all of its knowledge to mankind.
And it's funny, I probably would have done the same thing. I just felt an immediate impulse to, and in my mind, like if I had been there and seen that, I would have run to it and just like put my hands on it just to feel that energy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what it was like. And it was just so profound because till then all the graffiti and everybody else then took it over and stuff. And this was so funny because how it was given to me, the impression of it was like library cards. You ever see? I saw library cards that were open, and these library cards were just opening. And
Oh
they
my
were just,
gosh.
and like it was like information from a library that was just flying out into the ethers.
Oh my
so
gosh.
she was just sending all this knowledge into the world.
Right.
Now grab it, children.
Now
grab
it's
it.
right, traveling all the vibrations that are happening, and
And then it put me at peace. And then again, then we all have the stories of why it happened, should it happen, who did that, who did what, and everything. And that's part of Giant Rock's history.
Yeah, exactly. So. And now we've got some issues happening out there which aren't so great. Got a lot of off-road vehicles and campers, and it just becomes a mess. And those of us who live here are pretty educated on what we should and shouldn't do in the desert, or at least we're getting educated. But what do we do about people who don't live here, who come out and use that every weekend or once a month or something like that, and just are destroying the ecosystem there?
This has been my biggest challenge.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be really honest. I have been working with this since 2006. Okay, I became the president of the Morongo Basin Historical Society, and I went into this gun ho. I'm saving the world. I'm going to put up cameras. I'm going to fight in the government. I'm going to government. I'm going to go this and that. Boy, did I get my eyes wide open. It's just not that easy, and it really has hurt quite a bit to see over time now, especially because there'll be visitors that come out there and you'll read things that they will post, and they talk about our community, and they'll say, those people that are out there, they're just pigs. They don't know how to live. Look at that. They see it as a representation of us.
Right, as opposed to the other tourists, their fellow tourists that are coming out and doing that.
Them coming out here. And I'm always, the phone calls I get at my home, they track me down to my personal home.
Wow.
And people who don't understand even the gun laws that you have in the desert.
Right. Yep.
They still think you could go out there and drop bombs. We're allowed to because it's the desert. And no, you're not allowed to do that. And then you have construction workers who load up their trucks and take their crap out there to the middle of the desert.
As if it's a dump. And the tires. That's the thing that's been happening too, right?
Oh,
yeah.
Massive issues with tires. So what do? All we can do is educate. That's all we can do. People have said, well, put cameras up, put this up, do that. And I say, this is Giant Rock. These are just little boulders in the middle of the desert. You have something like the national park having this issue.
Exactly.
I go, how do this little person in the middle of the desert, fight this when the national park, the government, can't?
They can't keep control of it either. Right.
And I kind of follow what they're doing. I want to keep track of what they're doing.
Sure.
Because I represent there. The only thing we kind of do is we keep track of it. Now, if there are big events coming on, like we won't go out there and clean until
it's done.
It's all done. Because it's senseless to do that until get it all out of your system, people.
Right. We often say, pack out what you pack in. That means everything. That means your water bottles. That means your excrement. That means all your paper towels and tissues and bottles and cans, and everything's got to go.
The people of the area up there are very aware, and the county also steps in quite a bit. They have cleaning time. They will pay for dumpsters to come in once or twice a year. They encourage the community to go out and pick up the tires and to go into the desert and to do that. But it's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. Yeah, and then if you're doing it in the summertime, it is brutal out there.
You got it.
It is brutal.
You got it.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So what do they do about the graffiti? Do they have a way to clean it, cover it, or do they just leave it?
Graffiti. Well, the ultimate goal here is to do primarily what the Mojave Desert Land Trust, does, and or the park does. And there's this stuff that is primarily used. It's called elephant snot.
That's what I've heard it called, yeah.
The ultimate goal for us is to get the rock painted back to a decent color. People will ask, well, why don't you just go in and sandblast it? And they go, no, because you can't sandblast it because it degrades its original
texture and everything. And then it sends all that stuff into the air.
It's not...
Which is not good for anybody.
No, it's not good. I do have to admit, I'm burned out.
Sure. I mean, it wears on you. When I lived in downtown LA, I was very active in advocacy on Skid Row with homeless, and that'll wear you down. So you have to know when to take some time and step away. It's not that you don't care, but you've got to be able to say, I need to take care of me because I'm no good to myself or anybody else if I continue in this direction as much as you care.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am. That's why until now my husband he's on my case. Why didn't you make your new website? Why aren't you updating your Facebook pages? Why aren't you doing? Because I'm just tired. I just don't
need a break. Well, I wonder sometimes too if things, people get colds, they get ill. Sometimes it just manifests like you need to rest. And this is what's going to happen. And I wonder if that's what happened with your ankle injury.
Could be.
Like, you need to sit down for a while and relax. So we were talking before we got on mic about the spirituality that's here and causing different things to happen. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Starting with Giant Rock and the spirituality, the Native Americans of this area were also pulled to the magnificence of Giant Rock. They knew something was there, and they used Giant Rock as a sacred space. And they would meet at the seasons of spring and fall on their way from Yuma to Big Bear. And only the shamans and the chief of the tribes were allowed to stay around Giant Rock. The actual tribesmen had to stay miles away. They would do ceremonies, sacred ceremonies. And many people don't know this, but there is an imprint of a scorpion, a petroglyph that is imprinted on Giant Rock.
Oh, cool.
It's fading away with time. Many people don't know about it. I usually point it out to people when I'll take a tour or do something out there. But it's getting sad because people are starting to know about it now. And again, when they know about it, it gets destroyed.
Word spreads and
Then it rolls into the common history of when the homesteaders started coming to the land, because Charlie Ricci, he was the first white man to come to that particular area. And Charlie Ricci, everybody knows about Ricci Road.
Right.
But Ricci was also involved with the Willie Boy. He was on the last posse looking for Willie Boy.
Wow.
What's interesting about Charlie Ricci, he owned the ranch where the Integratron now sits.
Oh, wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, and he became the first white man to be allowed or permitted to do ceremony with the Native American tribes of this area at Giant Rock. And it becomes really interesting, gets really intense, because you have three men. You'll have Charlie Ricci, a man named Frank Kreitzer, and George Van Tassel. Three men whose history all tied together. And if you didn't have their history tied together, you wouldn't have any of this happening. After Charlie Ricci came to the area, there was another man I mentioned, Frank Kreitzer. Now, everybody can go up online and read about Frank. I think they've heard about the man.
I think I just recently heard about him.
But what you're going to read about him mainly is that he dug under Giant Rock. He made a hole and he made his house under Giant Rock. And his claim to fame was that he blew himself up under the rock. And the story you're going to read online primarily about him is poor Frank. There was a Riverside sheriffs that came out. They threw dynamite under there, blew him apart. He had a really bad life and all this other stuff. But that wasn't so. Through my research, through the Historical Society and part of the research I've done, I found out that Frank Kreitzer, a lot of people claim that he was a German spy. No, he wasn't. He was actually born in Virginia. natural-born American citizen, made his way to California, became friends with George Van Tassel at one time, came out here to the desert. He is responsible for 64 miles of roads leading to Giant Rock. He built the roads we actually use today to go to Giant Rock. He's the guy that is responsible for building Giant Rock Airport, the airport that we know of out there. Frank Kreitzer built that. And how the story really goes is that Frank Kreitzer himself, there was a thing called the old man's draft. During a time, the U.S. government was requiring men between the ages of 18 and 64 to register for the draft when World War II was happening. And Frank happened to be 54. And there were sheriffs that went out there that offered to drive him to Banning. And Frank he had some dark side to him too, and there's some additional stories. But basically, he didn't want to go with the sheriffs. And he had around his neck a pair of binoculars with some wires attached to dynamite. And, and when the sheriffs came to get him, he said, "No,
you're not taking me.
I'm not going,
right.
But we're all going to hell together." And he put the wires together and ended up blowing himself.
Wow.
And a couple of the sheriffs.
Oh, my goodness.
I have a lot of documents from his death certificate, and people don't know he's actually buried over in Victorville. But that was Frank Kreitzer. But Frank Kreitzer also is was a friend of George Van Tassel. Many of the people here know George Van Tassel from the spaceship conventions that were out there.
Right.
And
Dee Davis talks about that in her episode.
Now, what's so interesting about that, and I'm going to share this with you because I had my eyes wide open. When I first moved here to the desert, I was just so happy to be here. And I thought everybody in the world loved Giant Rock and the Integratron just as much as I did. And the first thing I wanted to do was to have a spaceship convention. I wanted to have so with knowing the girls at the Integratron, they agreed. And they says, okay, let's do it. And so we put together a convention called Retro UFO. And they were a complete failure. We had more publicity. It was covered by USA Today. I had it out of New York. I had it on all the media I could have. But I had no support from none of the locals. And I thought, well, maybe this is a fluke or whatever. So I tried it again the next year. Same thing happened. What's going on here? What's this George Van Tassel guy?
Yeah.
So that's when I stepped up and decided to become president of the Historical Society. And I did research then into who George Van Tassel was and how he intermingled with the community. And I found out there was a side that totally loved him, and then there was a side that totally did not love him.
And what do you know what their reasons were for not?
Well, they had two different things. Some didn't like what he was doing out there,
Right.
You had to understand he had spent 18 years of his life building the Integratron. He put a lot of work into it. And then some of the people just looked at him like they didn't like what was going on, and they saw him with a different light.
Do you think it was a clash of science versus religion?
Cultures, yeah. Science and religion.
Yeah.
And that's definitely the position that was taking. And what was going on, an interesting venture that I also uncovered during that particular time, that when George Van Tassel was out here, he was here during a time that something unique was happening to this whole valley. Because if you look during the time between 1950s to the 1970s, you'll find that there was a migration of spirituality to this area. You'll find that that's when the mental physics was started. You'll find that Desert Christ Park came into play at that time. You'll find that down and below, Cabot Yurtsa from the Cabots Lodge, Desert Hot Springs. That started also. So this whole area started to buzz with spirituality. And an interesting thing also, too, being involved with the Historical Society, there was a time that there was so many UFO sightings in this particular area that people actually put out newsletters. I have documented newsletters that people put out where they would put out weekly sightings.
Wow.
Of their spots of where so and so saw a UFO in the sky this week. This is what they saw. This is happening here. It seems so natural, so nonchalant. People were interested in learning other techniques, like mental physics, getting into yoga, breathing. And the desert was calling that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking in 29 Palms, Dr. Lucky. Dr. Lucky even came with a new version for the Marines and saying, this place is different. It's good for your lungs. It's healthy.
Right. Yeah, the air is dry and yeah.
So you had this whole thing just evolving here. But something kind of happened in like mid 70s. Everybody just kind of went back to sleep, because when I'm following the history records through the historical societies,
right,
that's what I tracked.
And now you feel like it's returning. 2000
is when
is that when the rock split?
Yeah. Rock split the 2000. Yeah.
Interesting.
Rock split 2000.
Yeah.
And that's when you're seeing this migration, and you're seeing people coming here now, and they're looking for the connection back to Earth.
Seeking.
Seeking. And I'm just finding it so fascinating. And, and I'm feeling sad because, back then is when I had all the energy to put into it. And now I'm like, I'm poop dad, guys, and I'm looking for mentors. Like, come on, let me give you all my information so you can carry this.
You can carry the torch.
Yeah, carry the torch, please.
Yeah.
Because this is so cool. This is what I'm seeing happening now is exciting in one way, but we've got to keep it on the path so it doesn't burn out again.
Well, maybe someone hearing this podcast and hearing your passion about it, where can people find all this information?
Mainly, I'm going to work very hard in the new year to keep my Facebook page updated. I do a little thing called Giant Rock Tidbits, where I like to put little bits of the history of Giant Rock up there.
And is that on your personal Facebook page, or do you have an actual Facebook page for
Giant Rock Project?
Giant Rock Project. Okay, and I will put that in the links that I share on the website.
And I do have a website called giantrockproject.com. But again, this particular place sits on it sits on a longitude on the 33rd North Parallel. Because on the 33rd North Parallel, there's the most UFO sightings.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Around the world.
Around the world. Joshua Tree National Park sits exactly on the 33rd North Parallel. Giant Rock and us a little bit off. You're a little bit off.
Right.
But you could be as much as like on the 34th, 30th. It's like the matter of like a couple miles, and you're still within that same energy field.
Yeah.
You've had the most impactful experiences happen on the 33rd North Parallel. Things like the Sedona Lights, the Phoenix Lights happen. Also the Bermuda Triangle. There's the Great Pyramids of Giza. Then impactful things like the Robert F. Kennedy was shot. You have Waco, Texas. Look it up.
Yeah.
And it has a lot to do with, also deals with the Masons. It has a very
lots of mystery and
very auspicious number. Christ lived on Earth for 33 years, 33 DNA strands in the human body.
Well, I have really enjoyed talking with you today. This is something that we haven't discussed at all on the podcast, and I know a lot of people have interest in Giant Rock, or if they live here and haven't been out there yet, this I think will definitely get them to go out and see it, and maybe take a trash bag with them to pick up on the way. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this.
There's
it's awesome.
So much to say.
Right, exactly.
As I neared the end of editing this particular podcast, I realized the portion with Barbara's conversation ended at 33 minutes. And 35 seconds, if we're being technical. Coincidence? Maybe. Thanks so much for listening to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast. I want you to know how much I appreciate you taking the time to tune in. If there was something that enlightened or inspired you, let me know by sharing it with me and the other listeners on the Desert Lady Diaries Facebook page. Next week, Gail Austin talks to us about growing up in 29 Palms, leaving the desert, learning desk jobs were not for her, and discovering and pursuing her passion in ministry, tattooing. Did you know that you can support the podcast with a donation? Just like Jessica Graybill or Amanda Goodrich. It's easy to do using the yellow donate button on the website, desertladydiaries.com. Your donation allows the podcast to remain ad-free and provides support for all the logistics necessary to keep it going. Any amount is appreciated. Thanks so much for listening.